Hello, welcome. This is Clayton Vance with Timeless Homes, and we're going to do a little rant today. We're going to talk about HOA design guidelines. I have to deal with them all the time because I design houses in pretty wealthy neighborhoods that are all gated and locked and have HOA design guidelines that dictate the visual requirements for the architecture within a community, which I think in most cases are honestly a joke, because in almost all of these neighborhoods that you go into, you can drive around 10 years after the fact and look around and say, oh, that was built in the fill in the blank. And that happens with every single one. So this idea of making quality, awesome looking stuff that everyone intended to begin with, you know, at the outset of the development, and it's like, okay, how are we going to ensure that we actually have really good looking architecture and it's going to be really cool in the future too? And they come up with these design guidelines that they think are going to result in these things, but they never do, because you can still wander around looking at, oh yeah, that was built in the fill in the blank. So why do these people continue to do it, and why do they not understand that, oh, by the way, this doesn't actually result in what I think you actually want in the long term? So if you're buying lots in one of these neighborhoods, I'm going to go through a list of my 5 biggest complaints that are in almost every single design guideline HOA mess that I have to deal with, and it's probably the same throughout the U.S. And I guess I'm more libertarian in this sense that I would just assume let people kind of do what they want in most cases. And I know people are always concerned about property values. It's like, oh, they do something trashy. It's gonna, yeah, if you do something trashy, all right, but then we get into all these aesthetic discussions and what's beautiful, what's not beautiful, what's timeless, what's not timeless. Do you actually want timeless, or are you trying to do cool? And what's the legitimacy of something cool versus not cool? And how long do we want these things to actually be visually durable in the end? It's like, okay, so if we're actually planning this thing for only 30 years, maybe we don't care about it, you know? So anyway, here they are, my 5 biggest pet peeves. Style restrictions. Inevitably, there's always style restrictions. You cannot do Spanish colonial. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. You can't do a Georgian. It's just stupid. And then there's others that require those. And I get it. We'll come back to it. The next one, I have my list over here so I can remember these things. Plane breaks. Every X feet, you have to break the facade every 2 feet. And so if this is your facade and this is your front, it's like, okay, every X amount of feet, the longest I've seen is 30. Most of the time it's like between 20 and 30. You have to break it back 2 feet or 3 feet or something like that. And then that provides visual interest. Right. The next is ridgelines. You do the same thing with ridgelines. So here's a ridgeline. It's like, oh, it can't be too uniform. So break it up and make it feel like it's part of the what? Part of the, I don't know, part of the environment. It doesn't make any sense to me. And then another one is height restrictions. I get it, particularly if you live on a slope, that you want to prevent something getting too tall so that it doesn't block anyone's view. Though we'll get into my pet peeve with height restrictions in a minute. And then the last one is materials. Percentage material requirements. You have to have X percentage of this, X percentage of that, blah, 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 blah. It just takes more time to actually design because I have to calculate every single thing on the facade. It's like, oh my gosh, this is just ridiculous. And the material doesn't matter, or the percentage doesn't matter, because I can make anything look stupid based on your requirements. And so let's dive into each one of these things just a little bit more on my little rant here. Stylistic references. If based on those other requirements and their stylistic things, what they're trying to do oftentimes is create some sort of a sense of place, quote unquote, air quotes, whatever you want to call them, this contextualism, any sort of thing, be like, this is what belongs here because this is what belongs here. And it's like, who's to determine what actually belongs there? In my opinion, it's like, if you think it's beautiful, build what you think is beautiful. Because Before we came to any of this stuff in the US, it was just wigwams and tents and mud huts. That's what actually belongs here. Back in Europe, I mean, same sort of thing. Castles and fortresses and everything before that, the Romans and all their awesome buildings. And so in terms of like straight up contextualism, what actually belongs here, the sense of place, all that type of stuff, in my personal opinion, I think is crap. Because in the end, what we're trying to achieve is some sort of sense of community that if everything within the community is based on actual timeless design principles, hierarchy, order, simple massing, great details, the ornamentation around openings, etc., 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 everything's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. And these honestly very focused stylistic restrictions that try to pinhole you into a certain direction end up being really fancy McMansions. And that's all they are. Just because you put really nice materials on a house that has gable, hip, gable, shed, whatever, doesn't make it better. It just makes it more expensive. It's still going to be just as trendy, and you'll still look back at it and be like, oh, that was built in the, just like I said earlier. So that's one of my pet peeves. So when you're designing, buying, whatever in these HOAs, just recognize that there's going to be serious restrictions. Man, I had one, and it just becomes a nightmare. I had one where we got the CC&Rs, and they didn't really have design guidelines, and they didn't say this was not allowed. And they didn't even define what it was that was not allowed, if that made any sense. And we designed this house based on that, and then we had this letter that was applied to the design for your HOA approval letter, and then on the letter, not on the actual CC&Rs or real design guidelines, it said modernism wasn't allowed. And so we were doing this really cool, and it was cool, modern house, and then we got in this big old argument with the HOA about what's approved, what's not approved, what's modern, what's not modern. Why are you defining this as modern, but I'm defining it as mountain, contemporary? And there's complete ambiguity in all these definitions. There's no real codified stylistic interpretations of any of this stuff. And you go in that particular neighborhood, and most of the houses just look like standard McMansions. They're almost garbage. Sorry for anyone who lives there if you know what I'm talking about. But it's just stupid trying to codify things that aren't codifiable, particularly when it comes to style prevention and dictatorships. So anyway, that's my rant on item number 1. My rant on item number 2, which was, I need to look at my notes, plane brakes. This is just stupid. This is in every single one I deal with. Facade, every X feet, you have to break it up for visual interest so it doesn't get too plain. All I want to say with that, and it has to do with the styles too, is there's virtually no actual real timeless house until you get to the Victorian age that does that. They are always just simple box, simple facade. Vernacular stuff, go to Europe, look at all the vernacular stuff. Just a wall, because it's the cheapest thing to build, and they just build it of stone. It's the easiest thing to do. And then the material, the focus is on the materials and the details and how those things open, and it's that connection to earth. It's not these arbitrary plane break requirements. And so here is a whole host of pictures that would disobey or just go against the plane break requirement in virtually every HOA design guideline, that none of these would be approved. So that's, I've run into this before, even in kind of lower key HOAs where they didn't have stylistic requirements, where they didn't prevent styles. It's like, yeah, you could actually design a colonial, you could actually design whatever, you could design one of these things, but that frickin' stupid plane break requirement, you actually can't. You can't. You cannot design a timeless house because someone came up with an arbitrary rule in order to provide visual interest that is only providing more visual interest if you think more is better. And more is not better. Okay, that's all you need to know on that. The next is the Ridgelines. Most HOAs will do the same thing with Ridgelines, and it's like, Okay, so if you're on a hill and you're looking at a very uniform ridge line, what's the material the roof is made of? It's weird because when you go to these, I have to keep going back to these old European villages because they break every single HOA design guideline requirement there ever was. In terms of just uniform facades that don't break. And the only thing, and height restrictions, they're actually built on the top of hills. That's the other thing that's in concert with this ridge line requirement to break up your ridge and do these weird things is, and I get that one more than the actual facade break, but then there's the height restriction requirement and ridge line requirements on mountains and hills and other things that you can't build actually on the ridge, and so you can see the ridge of the mountains. I get it from one standpoint. However, if we could do something as awesome as those old medieval villages in terms of like, what's on the ridge and what are we looking at, if it's some sort of really beautiful, iconic either village or collection of houses or house or something like that really was pretty stunning, man, I don't have any problem looking at that because it's awesome. If things really, like I said in other videos, and go watch these other videos, because what it has to do with is overall character, right? We hate development. Why do we hate development most of the time? And we're in the not in my backyard attitude. We hate development most of the time because the land that we're gobbling up with houses is being replaced with stuff that has less inherent character than the stuff we're putting on it, than we're replacing it with. I don't think I said that right. Essentially, if we were to, design architecture on new land that is at the same quality of character, meaning beauty, of the stuff that we're replacing, we wouldn't object nearly as much. But we're honestly so pathetic that we don't. And we just complain. So that's where we are. Don't put up that development. Don't put up that development. Why? Because we know it's going to be ugly. So all of you who are listening out there, if you design houses or if you design cities, engineers, home designers, architects, everyone, quit designing ugly stuff. Engineers, quit designing terrible, like completely dedicated stuff to, anyway, car transportation, off on that rant. It has to do with ridge lines, and it goes back to ridge lines because a roof can be a beautiful thing, an absolutely beautiful thing. When you look down, if you're up here in one of these mountain villages and you're looking down and you see all these awesome roofs in a village, it's pretty cool. And so the material that you use on the roof is more important than breaking up the ridge line. And the overall architectural character of it is just as important. So that's all I have to say about that. The height restriction I get because you don't want to block someone's view. However, most height restrictions that I deal with in the area that I am is like 34 feet-ish, 32 to more like 28 to 35 feet. You can't get a 3-story house in there. Do you realize that most houses in cities that were started as suburbs now have become part of cities, particularly in the East, and you know this because if you guys live there, they're taller than that because they're 3 stories, and so you'd have kind of a crawl space and your main floor, upper floor, and an attic story. And they're more like 40, 45, something like that. And townhouses, same sort of thing. And cities and communities and HOA design guidelines that put on these arbitrary restrictions are increasing kind of real estate values and pricing everyone out of the market because you can't go up. And also they're preventing a whole bunch of great architecture. There was one project I did that's awesome, the River Bottoms Ranch. If anyone knows, it's an awesome wedding venue here where I am. And it's frustrating to me because the idiotic height restriction prevented me from actually doing a properly proportioned Dutch barn. There's certain, a really nice proportion. I think it's 60 and then 30, 30 and 60 in terms of the angle degrees and stuff. But I couldn't do it. It needed to be, I think, about 6 feet taller than it was in order to be perfect. But it seems a little bit squatty to me because I couldn't do the proportions because of stupid height restrictions. And I don't know exactly why people put them on, and I don't know why people are so adamant about them, and I don't know why people are scared. But if you have one person do a completely idiotic thing, it's like, okay, the one person did a completely idiotic thing. Most people aren't going to do completely idiotic things. And so you have to trust that most people are going to be pretty good. Okay, enough with that. So that was Ridgelines, height restrictions, and then the final thing is this material requirement. I've dealt with HOA design committees and stuff where they require X percentage of materials, or you have to use more than 2 materials or 3 materials on any one facade. It's like, no, you completely misunderstand how materials are supposed to be used. And because you've already misunderstood how buildings are supposed to work in terms of the composition is supposed to be volumetric, not just these arbitrary roof or these plane breaks relative to some arbitrary floor plan out design. If we're designing a fully comprehensive, cohesive thing, what we're trying to do is do a volume, design volumes, not floor plans with random plane breaks and a bunch of random roofs all over the place. No, simple volumes, simple roof structures, great details around the openings. You change up materials in order to highlight the openings, right? And that's what helps provide the hierarchy and the order within the entire system. It's not just put stone here and then siding here, or siding here and then shingles up here in the gable and then put this there and there, whatever. It's like, no, everyone. And most of the people that I continue to talk to, especially my generation coming up, it's like we're tired of the stuff we grew up in because we recognize that it's cheap and it's fake. And we want something more authentic, right? And that's and the generation coming up, same sort of thing. Though they swing more modern in terms of what I can tell, all you guys. So what we're trying to do is, and the whole goal of this thing that I'm trying to get out there is that there is a way to design timeless houses, and there's a way to build timeless houses. They're two different things, even though they should be married. But if you cannot actually use completely natural materials for everything, I get it. It's super expensive. You have to use some engineered materials. And so how do you make the design better so it looks better? It may not age as well as if it did if it had natural materials, but there's a way to design houses so that they can actually age with grace and get more beautiful as they age. And regrettably, most HOA design guidelines suck. Who writes them? Who are you people out there that actually write these things? Because they suck. And we need to understand what it is to actually design timeless things so that you're not just putting a heavy burden on architects and residential designers and owners because it costs so much more to meet all of these requirements. I mean, it costs so much to do all these stupid calculations and everything. And anyway, but if you want to build in these neighborhoods and you want to design in these neighborhoods and you want to own in these neighborhoods, go right ahead. Most of them are pretty awesome because of the amenities that they have and the fact that they're gated, and so you don't have to worry about your house. But anyway, for those of you who are libertarian minded and or want to do whatever you want to do, talk to your city people and make sure that they don't have any of these idiotic requirements. Unless you're something like, I mean, for instance, let me just say one thing to finish this off, kind of like Santa Barbara or a community kind of like that has a very specific stylistic theme and character that they're trying to go for. And there is some merit, I get it, there is some merit to having some sort of consistent, stylistic consistency throughout a city because it lends itself to where the sum of the parts is, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's how the phrase goes. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So each individual component of the entire community is collectively participating in a community kind of character narrative. Whereas what happens in these HOA things, they're trying to do that, but every single person who moves in there does not want their house to look like the next door neighbors. And so they're like, well, how do we make ours different? How do we make it cool? And I don't know. That's a whole nother something we can talk about. But in the end, good luck. And yeah, let's realize and watch these videos so that you understand here's what actually makes really great architecture, great cities. So until next time, thanks for listening to my rant. See you later.